September 12, 1942, about 2200 South Atlantic, approx. 130 miles NNE of Ascension Island. The South Atlantic is a graveyard of silence. Here, 600 miles off the African coast, the war usually feels distant, a rumor carried on the trade winds. But tonight, the war has arrived with mechanical precision. The ocean is pitch black, the moon obscured, and the swells are running long and deep. Cutting through this void is the RMS Laconia. She is a leviathan of a bygone era, a former Cunard White Star liner weighing in at nearly 20,000 gross registered tons. In peacetime, she carried passengers in luxury across the Atlantic. Now, her hull is painted a drab wartime gray, her portholes are sealed, and she is armed with deck guns that offer more psychological comfort than actual protection. She is alone, a solitary giant moving through the Atlantic Gap, that terrifying stretch of ocean beyond the reach of Allied air cover. On board, the manifest is a staggering logistical puzzle, a microcosm of the global conflict packed into steel bulkheads. There are 2,732 souls aboard this ship. The crew, 463 men of the British Merchant Navy, are anxious. They know the dangers of these waters. There are 286 British soldiers, passengers in uniform, heading home or to new postings. There are 80 civilians, including women and children, families caught in the wrong hemisphere when the world caught fire. But the vast majority of the human cargo is hidden below the waterline. Locked in the holds are approximately 1,793 Italian prisoners of war, men captured in the deserts of North Africa, now being transported to camps in Britain. Guarding them are 103 Polish soldiers, men who have lost their own country to the Axis powers, and whose hatred for the enemy is personal and raw. The Laconia is a floating powder keg of tension, steaming northeast. Stalking her is U-156. She is a Type IXC U-boat, a long-range hunter designed for exactly this kind of patrol. Her commander is Korvettenkapitän Werner Hartenstein, a 33-year-old naval officer with a reputation for both aggression and a strange, old-world sense of chivalry. He has been tracking the smoke and the silhouette of the heavy steamer for hours. To Hartenstein, the Laconia is not a ship full of prisoners and civilians. She is a legitimate target, a British troop transport sailing without escort. In the brutal arithmetic of tonnage warfare, she is a prize that will earn his crew medals and leave a gaping hole in Allied logistics. At 22:07 hours, the waiting ends. Hartenstein gives the order. Lows. 2 torpedoes streak from the bow tubes of U-156. They run true, invisible predators racing at 40 knots beneath the surface. The impact is catastrophic. The first torpedo hammers the Laconia amidships. The explosion shreds the steel plating, venting the boilers and sending a shudder through the vessel that knocks men from their bunks. Moments later, the second torpedo strikes further aft, tearing into the holds. The lights flicker and die. The Laconia groans, a metallic scream of twisting iron, and immediately begins to list. Inside the ship, the order of civilization collapses instantly. The air fills with the acrid stench of cordite, coal dust, and fear. For the passengers on the upper decks, the civilians and the officers, it is a scramble for life jackets and lifeboat stations. But deep in the bowels of the ship, in the prisoner holds, the scene is one of absolute bedlam. The torpedoes have hit dangerously close to the Italian quarters. Hundreds are killed instantly in the blast, vaporized or crushed by collapsing bulkheads. For the survivors, the water is already rising, black and oily, rushing in to claim them. The Italians panic. They are trapped in a sinking steel coffin. They rush the companionways, desperate to reach the upper decks and the open air. But the way is barred. The Polish guards, acting on standing orders to prevent a prisoner uprising or perhaps driven by the chaos of the moment, hold the line. In the darkness of the stairwells, bayonets flash. Gunshots ring out over the sound of rushing water. It is a brutal, intimate struggle in the dark, prisoners fighting to escape drowning, guards fighting to maintain order on a dying ship. On the boat deck, the situation is hardly better. The Laconia is listing heavily to starboard, making it nearly impossible to launch half the lifeboats. The davits jam, ropes tangle, Men shout conflicting orders. Captain Rudolph Sharp, a veteran seaman, realizes the ship is doomed. He orders the women and children to the boats first, maintaining the ancient law of the sea even as his command disintegrates beneath his feet. Among the civilians is Doris Hawkins, a missionary nurse returning to England. She clutches a baby girl, a child entrusted to her care, as she navigates the tilting deck. The night is a cacophony of steam venting and human screaming. She manages to find a place in a lifeboat, but the launch is a disaster. The boat capsizes in the swell, throwing its occupants into the oil-slicked water. Hawkins fights to the surface, gasping for air, the baby gone from her arms, lost to the Atlantic. She is hauled into another boat, one of the few that made it down safely. It is meant to hold dozens. It carries only 16 terrified survivors. By 23:23 hours, barely an hour and a half after the first torpedo hit, the RMS Laconia rears her bow toward the sky and slides beneath the waves. The silence returns, but it is not the silence of the empty ocean. It is replaced by a terrifying sound that Werner Hartenstein can hear even through the hull of his submarine, the sound of thousands of people screaming. Hartenstein brings U-156 to the surface. The hunt is over. Now comes the confirmation. Standard procedure dictates that the U-boat commander should verify the sinking, perhaps capture the ship's senior officers for intelligence, and then vanish before Allied aircraft or destroyers can respond. The survivors in the water are, according to the cold logic of naval warfare, unfortunate collateral damage. But as the submarine cuts through the debris field, the sounds drifting up to the conning tower are not English commands or the cries of British sailors. They are shouting in Italian. Aiuto, aiuto. Hartenstein, standing on the bridge of U-156, realizes with a jolt that the intelligence reports were incomplete. He has not just sunk a British troop transport. He has torpedoed a prison ship carrying his nation's allies. The water is thick with fuel oil and blood, and thrashing within it are hundreds of men of the Regina Marina and the Italian army, men who had survived the Desert War only to be abandoned in the middle of the Atlantic. The German commander faces a binary choice. He can follow the strict dictates of the Kriegsmarine, submerge, and leave these men to drown or be eaten by the sharks that are already gathering in the phosphorescent wake, or he can compromise the safety of his vessel and his crew to save them. Hartenstein chooses the latter. The order goes down the hatch. Rescue operations. Pick up survivors. What follows is one of the most surreal episodes of the Second World War. The U-boat, a machine designed solely for destruction, transforms into a lifeboat. German sailors, who minutes earlier were celebrating a kill, now lean over the slippery casing, hauling oil-soaked Italians, British civilians, and Polish soldiers from the sea. The distinction between friend and foe dissolves in the salt water. By the early hours of September 13, U-156 is no longer a combat vessel. She is a refugee camp. Nearly 200 survivors are crammed onto the narrow deck and inside the pressure hull. The submarine is dangerously overloaded, its trim compromised, sitting low and sluggish in the swells. But there are still hundreds more in the water, clinging to wreckage or overcrowding the few lifeboats that launched successfully. Hartenstein knows he cannot hold them all. He needs help, and he needs it from anyone who can hear him. At 600 hours, Hartenstein makes a decision that defies every protocol of submarine stealth. He orders his radio operator to transmit a message in plain English on the 25-meter band, a frequency monitored by commercial shipping and Allied naval forces. If any ship will assist the shipwrecked Laconia crew, I will not attack her, providing I am not being attacked by ship or air forces. I picked up 193 men. 4 degrees, 53 minutes south, 11 degrees, 26 minutes west. German submarine. It is a ceasefire offer broadcast into the void. Back in Paris, at U-boat command, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz is awakened with the news. The situation is a strategic nightmare. A U-boat has revealed its position and is effectively out of action. However, the political fallout of allowing hundreds of Italian allies to drown is unacceptable. Dönitz, balancing military pragmatism with the demands of the Axis alliance, orders two other boats in the sector, U-506 under Kapitän Lieutenant Erich Wudemann and U-507 under Korvettenkapitän Haro Schacht, to break off their patrols and race to the scene. The Italian submarine Comandante Capellini is also dispatched. For the next 2 days, the South Atlantic witnesses a bizarre regatta of mercy. Under the blistering equatorial sun, the submarines converge. By September 15, the ocean around the coordinates is a hive of activity. U-506 arrives and takes on 132 Italians. U-507 picks up a staggering 491 survivors, filling every inch of space. Men are standing shoulder to shoulder in the torpedo rooms, and women and children are huddled on the casing. The scene on the water is both horrific and humane. The sharks are relentless, picking off those who drift away from the main groups. Thirst is becoming a killer as potent as the ocean itself. Yet, amidst this, German sailors are sharing their rations, dressing wounds, and offering cigarettes to the very British soldiers they are sworn to kill. To signal their intent to any passing aircraft, the commanders drape large, improvised Red Cross flags across the decks of the U-boats, white sheets painted with red lead. On the morning of September 16, the fragile truce is tested. The low drone of heavy engines cuts through the sound of the wind. High above, a B-24 Liberator bomber circles. It is operating out of the secret American airbase on Ascension Island, commanded by Brigadier General Robert C. Richardson, III. Down below, on the bridge of U-156, Hartenstein watches the 4-engine bomber bank. He does not dive. He orders his signalman to use a blinker light to transmit in Morse code to the aircraft, identifying himself in the presence of survivors. He points to the large Red Cross flag spread across the gun deck, where hundreds of people are exposed to the sky. He trusts that the code of the sea, the ancient understanding that you do not kill the shipwrecked, will hold. In the cockpit of the B-24, the pilot, Lieutenant James D. Harden, sees the submarine. He sees the lifeboats trailing behind it on tow ropes. He sees the crowded decks, but the situation does not compute. A German U-boat on the surface towing British lifeboats flying a Red Cross flag. It looks like a ruse, or perhaps a target of opportunity. Harden radios back to Ascension Island for instructions. Submarine surfacing, left survivors in lifeboats, Red Cross flag on deck. What are orders? The request lands on the desk of the Composite Force Commander at Ascension. The base is a critical, secret staging post for the ferry route to Africa. The security of the airfield is paramount. The presence of a U-boat so close to the island is a direct threat. Furthermore, the rules of war as interpreted by the U.S. Army Air Forces do not recognize a submarine as a Red Cross vessel. In the heat of the moment, with limited intelligence and the paranoia of wartime, the nuance of Hartenstein's humanitarian mission is lost. The order comes back cold and unambiguous: sink sub. At 12:32 hours, the B-24 lines up for its attack run. On the deck of U-156, the survivors wave, thinking the plane is the vanguard of a rescue fleet. Their relief turns to horror as the bomb bay doors open. The first stick of bombs falls short, exploding in the water and sending geysers of spray over the submarine. The concussion rocks the vessel. Hartenstein screams orders, his voice cracking over the roar of the engines. Cut the lines, clear the deck. The German sailors frantically hack at the tow ropes. With axes and knives, severing the physical link to the lifeboats that drift in their wake. The hemp snaps with the sound of pistol shots, and the boats, suddenly cast adrift, slew violently in the submarine's wash. On the casing of U-156, the scene is one of absolute pandemonium. The Italians and British civilians who had been brought aboard for safety now find themselves on a platform that is about to become a tomb. Hartenstein, his face a mask of grim resolve, has no choice. The B-24 is banking for a second run, its bomb bay doors still yawning open. The first stick of bombs had missed by a margin of mere meters, the concussions hammering the pressure hull and shattering the battery cells. Chlorine gas, the silent killer of the submarine service, is already beginning to seep into the forward compartments. To stay on the surface is suicide. To dive is murder. "Alle Mann von Bord, tauchen," Hartenstein bellows, his voice cutting through the roar of the aircraft engines. "All hands overboard. Dive." It is a command that violates every instinct of a mariner, yet it is the only one that can save his crew. The German sailors on deck begin physically pushing the survivors back into the sea. There is no time for gentleness. Men and women are shoved off the slippery steel plating into the Atlantic swells. The water is churning, white and angry, as the U-boat's diesels roar, driving the vessel forward to gain diving momentum. The vents atop the ballast tanks smash open, releasing great geysers of air and spray. The bow of U-156 dips, cutting into the waves, and the ocean rushes in to reclaim the deck. From the cockpit of the Liberator, Lieutenant Harden watches the submarine slide beneath the surface. He drops his remaining depth charges on the swirling vortex of white water where the conning tower had been just seconds before. The explosives detonate with dull, heavy thuds, sending pillars of water hundreds of feet into the air. Below, inside the steel tube of U-156, the lights shatter and the hull groans under the hammer blows of the hydrostatic shock. Hartenstein orders the boat deep, leveling off at 60 meters, listening to the terrifying acoustics of the explosions. He checks his damage reports. The periscope is smashed, the radio transmitter is damaged, and the diesel engines are leaking oil. But the boat is alive. Above, on the surface, the silence that follows the roar of the B-24 is heavy with tragedy. The ocean is once again dotted with hundreds of heads, bobbing in the oil-slicked swell. The lifeboats, some overturned by the shockwaves of the depth charges, are scattered. The survivors, who minutes ago believed they were saved, are now back in the water, treading amidst the wreckage of their hopes. The sharks, driven away briefly by the noise of the engines and the explosions, begin to return, drawn by the vibrations of struggle. The attack on U-156 sends a shockwave through the rest of the rescue fleet. Hartenstein, despite his damaged equipment, manages to send a short, bitter signal to the other U-boats in the area. "Am attacked by American Liberator. Have dived, leaving survivors." Kapitän Lieutenant Erich Wudemann on U-506 and Korvettenkapitän Haro Schacht on U-507 receive the warning. They too are carrying hundreds of survivors on their decks. They too are flying the Red Cross flag. But the rules of engagement have shifted in the blink of an eye. The American attack has signaled that the humanitarian truce is over. The Laconia incident has ceased to be a rescue operation and has reverted to an active war zone. Reluctantly, fearing the appearance of more bombers from Ascension Island, the other commanders order their own decks cleared. The Italians and British on U-506 and U-507 are put back into lifeboats or, where boats are scarce, told to jump and cling to the rafts. The submarines button up and submerge, vanishing into the safety of the deep, leaving the surface of the South Atlantic to the dying. For the survivors, the next 24 hours are a descent into hell. The sun beats down with equatorial ferocity, blistering skin and cracking lips. Thirst becomes a torture more acute than the fear of drowning. In the overcrowded lifeboats, discipline begins to fray. Men drink seawater in desperation, succumbing to hallucinations and madness before dying. The Italian prisoners, many of whom are already weakened from their time in the desert camps and the trauma of the sinking, die in droves. Their bodies are slipped over the side, lightening the load but attracting more predators. But the machinery of rescue, once set in motion, has not completely ground to a halt. Admiral Dönitz, furious at the American intervention but still bound by the pragmatic need to save the Italians, had already reached out to the Vichy French government. From the port of Dakar in West Africa, French warships had been dispatched at high speed. On September 17, the horizon is broken by the gray silhouettes of the cruiser Gloire and the sloop Annamite. To the survivors, delirious with heat and exhaustion, the ships look like mirages. But as they draw closer, the tricolor flags snapping in the wind confirm their reality. The French sailors, operating under the complex and often bitter politics of the Vichy regime, work with professional efficiency. They lower boats and scramble nets, hauling the living and the dead from the water. The Gloire, a sleek La Galissonière-class cruiser, moves through the debris field, her crew pulling survivors from the scattered lifeboats. They find British officers, Polish soldiers, and Italian privates huddled together in the democracy of suffering. The rescue is massive in scale but tragic in its arithmetic. Of the 2,732 people who had been aboard the Laconia, only 1,113 are pulled from the water alive. The death toll stands at a staggering 1,619 souls. The vast majority of the dead, approximately 1,420, were Italian prisoners of war. These men, who had survived the brutal campaigns of North Africa and the suffocating hold of the troopship, found their end not in battle, but in the chaotic, oil-choked waters of the South Atlantic, abandoned by the very alliance they had served. The arrival of the Vichy French ships, the cruiser Gloire and the sloop Annamite, brings a semblance of order to the catastrophe, but it is a grim harvest. The French sailors, navigating the political tightrope of the Vichy regime, work with a singular focus, hauling 1,113 survivors from the sea. They find British officers and Polish guards side by side with Italian privates, the animosities of the war temporarily washed away by the sheer scale of the tragedy. Yet as the Gloire turns her bow toward Dakar, her decks crowded with the exhausted and the dying, the ocean has not surrendered all its hostages. In the confusion of the dispersal, with U-boats crash-diving and lifeboats scattered by the shockwaves of American depth charges, some are left behind. Among them is Doris Hawkins. A missionary nurse returning to England, she finds herself in lifeboat number 9, a small craft intended for calm waters, now adrift in the vast emptiness of the ocean. When the boat first hit the water, it carried 69 people, but the Atlantic is a merciless filter. As the days bleed into weeks, the sun beats down with a hammer-like intensity, blistering skin and swelling tongues. The water ration is measured in thimblefuls, the food non-existent. Hawkins watches as delirium takes the men around her. They hallucinate rivers of fresh water and step off the gunwales into the sea to drink, only to be taken by the sharks that shadow the boat. One by one, the occupants succumb to exposure, dehydration, and despair. For 27 days, Hawkins endures. She becomes the chronicler of a slow-motion horror, witnessing the population of her small wooden world dwindle from 69 down to a mere 16. Her survival is not just a testament to physical stamina, but to a psychological fortitude that refuses to break even when the horizon remains empty day after day. When they are finally picked up, nearly a month after the Laconia went down, the survivors are skeletal, their bodies ravaged by salt sores and starvation, living ghosts of an incident the world has already begun to forget. But while Hawkins drifts, the repercussions of the incident are traveling much faster than a lifeboat. They are flashing across the encrypted radio networks of the Kriegsmarine, reaching the nerve center of the German naval war effort. In Paris, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz is studying the after-action reports from U-156, U-506, and U-507. The details are infuriating to the German commander. His U-boats had acted with chivalry. They had exposed themselves to danger to save enemy sailors and civilians. They had broadcast their position on open channels, trusting in the unwritten laws of the sea. And in return, they had been bombed by an American aircraft. To Dönitz, the attack by the B-24 Liberator is not just a tactical violation. It is a confirmation that the old rules no longer apply. The Allies, he concludes, have abandoned the gentleman's war. If the Americans are willing to bomb submarines flying the Red Cross flag while they are rescuing drowning men, then the Kriegsmarine can no longer afford the luxury of mercy. The logic is cold, pragmatic, and deadly. A U-boat is a fragile asset, expensive to build and difficult to crew. Risking a boat to save the crew of a ship it has just sunk is, in the harsh calculus of total war, a strategic error. On September 17, 1942, 5 days after the sinking of the Laconia, Dönitz issues a directive that will darken the Battle of the Atlantic forever. It is transmitted to every U-boat commander at sea, a coded message known as Triton Null, or more infamously, the Laconia Order. The text is explicit. No attempt of any kind must be made at rescuing members of ships sunk. the order reads. This includes picking up persons in the water and putting them in lifeboats, righting capsized lifeboats, and handing over food and water. Rescue runs counter to the most primitive demands of warfare for the destruction of enemy ships and crews. Dönitz goes further, stripping away any lingering moral hesitation his commanders might feel. Be hard, he commands. Remember that the enemy has no regard for women and children when bombing German cities. With these words, the Atlantic war shifts gears. The ambiguity is gone. The U-boat is no longer a hunter that might occasionally show mercy. It is a dedicated killing machine. The order effectively sanctions unrestricted submarine warfare in its most absolute form. Commanders are forbidden from offering the small kindnesses that had previously punctuated the violence, the directions to the nearest land, the passing of a compass or a tin of biscuits. Now the survivors are to be left to the ocean, regardless of their condition or distance from shore. The Laconia order ripples through the fleet. For men like Werner Hartenstein, it is a bitter validation of the lesson learned under the bombs of the B-24. Hartenstein had tried to be humane, and it had nearly cost him his boat and his crew. He repairs the damage to U-156 at sea and resumes his patrol, but the shadow of the incident lingers. The man who had orchestrated the largest humanitarian rescue by a submarine in history is now bound by an order that forbids him from ever doing it again. Hartenstein's war does not last much longer. The hunter becomes the hunted. On March 8, 1943, less than 6 months after the Laconia incident, U-156 is operating east of Barbados. This time, there is no mixed manifest, no Italian allies, and no mercy. A United States Navy PBY Catalina flying boat spots the submarine on the surface. The engagement is brief and brutal. The aircraft straddles the U-boat with depth charges, breaking its back. U-156 sinks with all hands. Korvettenkapitän Werner Hartenstein, the officer who had once turned his warship into a sanctuary for 2,000 people, dies in the iron coffin of his command, lost in the same ocean where he had once defied orders to save lives. There are no survivors, and no rescue is attempted. The legacy of the Laconia incident, however, outlives both Hartenstein and the Third Reich. Years later, in the rubble of a defeated Germany, the Laconia order resurfaces in the solemn, wood-paneled courtroom of the Nuremberg trials. Admiral Dönitz stands accused of war crimes, and the prosecution presents the order of September 17 as Exhibit GB 199, proof of his intent to murder helpless survivors. It is a pivotal moment in naval law. The prosecution argues that forbidding rescue is tantamount to murder. They contend that by ordering his captains to remain submerged and ignore the drowning, Dönitz was actively participating in the extermination of enemy seamen. The courtroom in Nuremberg, miles from the salt spray of the Atlantic, becomes the final battlefield of the Laconia incident. The air is thick with the smoke of cigarettes, and the weight of history as the Allied prosecutors attempt to hang the German admiral on the hook of his own directive. But the defense, led by the astute fleet judge Otto Kranzbühler, prepares a counterstrike that will silence the room. He argues that the Laconia order was not an act of malice, but a necessary adaptation to the reality of air power, a reality proven by the bombs dropped on Werner Hartenstein. To prove his point, Kranzbühler reaches across the Atlantic, soliciting a sworn affidavit from the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz. The response from the American admiral is devastating to the prosecution's case. Nimitz states, with the blunt candor of a career sailor, that the United States Navy had engaged in unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan from the very first day of the conflict. American submarines in the Pacific were under no obligation to rescue survivors if doing so exposed the boat to danger. They, too, struck without warning. They, too, left survivors to the mercy of the ocean. The revelation hangs heavy in the courtroom. It exposes the uncomfortable truth that by 1942, the gentleman's war had been abandoned by all sides. The rules of the Hague Conventions had been rendered obsolete by the invention of radar and the long-range bomber. Dönitz is eventually convicted of crimes against peace and war crimes, sentenced to 10 years in Spandau prison, but he escapes the hangman's noose specifically on the charge of the Laconia order. The tribunal tacitly admits that in modern naval warfare, rescue is a luxury that neither the Axis nor the Allies could afford. While the lawyers argue over the semantics of survival in a heated courtroom, the reality of the decision made on Ascension Island remains a subject of bitter debate. To understand why the B-24 Liberator attacked a submarine flying a Red Cross flag, one must look through the eyes of the American commander, Robert C. Richardson, III. Ascension Island was not merely a rock in the ocean. It was the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the South Atlantic, a critical refueling point for Lend-Lease aircraft ferrying supplies to Africa and Europe. The security of this secret base was paramount. When the report came in that a German U-boat was on the surface just over 100 miles away, the context was fear, not mercy. The Americans knew that U-boats often used ruses to lure enemies closer. A surface submarine, even one towing lifeboats, was a potential spotter, a radio beacon that could guide a wolf pack to the island's vulnerable supply lines. In the claustrophobic operations room on Ascension, amidst the static of radios and the hum of fans fighting the equatorial heat, the nuance of Hartenstein's humanitarian mission was lost. The order to sink sub was driven by a doctrine that prioritized the safety of the airfield over the lives of the shipwrecked. It was a cold, mathematical decision that stripped the humanity from the equation, reducing the tragedy to coordinates and tonnage. The pilot of the B-24, Lieutenant James D. Harden, was merely the instrument of this doctrine. Flying at low altitude, seeing the upturned faces of the survivors and the white cloth of the Red Cross draped over the gun, he hesitated. He circled. He reported what he saw, but the chain of command, rigid and fearful of deception, snapped back with the order to attack. In that moment, the technological disconnect of modern war became clear. A pilot pressing a button at 2,000 feet does not see the eyes of the men he is dooming. He sees a silhouette, a target, a threat. The depth charges that tumbled from his bay did not just shatter the hull of a U-boat, they shattered the last remnants of the naval code of chivalry. Yet in the grand calculus of the war, the group that paid the highest price for this collision of doctrines was the one with the least agency, the Italians. The 1,793 prisoners of war aboard the Laconia were men who had already lost their war. They had surrendered in the burning sands of North Africa, hoping for survival and the quiet wait for peace, only to find themselves trapped between the unforgiving sea and the indifference of high-altitude warfare. Instead of sanctuary, they met a chaotic end where their status as non-combatants offered no shield against the ruthless logic of the Atlantic campaign. If you would like more war stories from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.